People are starting to come in. Hi, Susan. Hi, Rob. Hi, Corinna. How are you? This is our Americas update. It's great to have this esteemed panel with me. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to introduce you all in a moment. I'm just going to say what I always say, which is getting very boring for everybody, because I say this every single time we do one of these, which is, it's great to be on Zoom and it's lovely to have you here. I wish we were all in a conference room somewhere where we could actually see each other, and hopefully it won't be too long until we can actually all do that. Please at any time, please at any time put a question or a comment into the chat box. I'll keep my eye on that throughout. You can also see next to, or along the same line as the chat box, there's the Q&A. You can use that system as well. The Q&A, if you want to say something anonymously, the Q&A lets you do that. If you are using the chat box, just remember to scroll down to make sure it goes to everybody, because for some reason the Zoom default is host and panelists. I never quite know why it does that. So just scroll down on the little blue arrow to everyone, and then that will be public to everybody. Session is being recorded, so obviously, as you all know, I will be putting this onto YouTube, so it'll be available on demand. We've got 65 people signed up today, so thank you to everyone who signed up. You will get the link first, and thank you to everybody who's coming in. It's great to have you with us. We are still doing these updates because we were just saying before we started the call, the speed and trajectory of individual countries coming back into mobility, coming back into normality is just so different. And I think it's quite easy for us, you know, here I sit in the UK part of Europe, we're sort of trolling along at more or less the same speed. In the US, we think about the same thing, but it's not the case, and countries are evolving at very different speeds. And so just to get a little snapshot of, you know, how things are, but also how mobility is faring, I am delighted to introduce you to this panel. Laura Ganon from Fink Mobility, it's lovely to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Bentinck from Relo, based in Mexico. Lovely to see you again. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, Dom.
Pleasure. Brenda Levis from NYC Navigator. We were just saying, I haven't seen you since we were in Vietnam. It's lovely to see you.
Nice to be with you, Dom.
And Maura Carey from Dwellworks. Always great to see you, Maura. Thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you. A pleasure. Thanks for inviting.
It's honestly, thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to start where we started actually with this discussion, because Laura, when you came in, you've actually traveled.
I did. And I found out there's life outside my apartment, which was a big surprise. I was telling Dom, I felt like a person that comes out of a cave after a nuclear disaster and find out there are other human beings living a life without a mask.
It is.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I went to France, and despite for a 1 week travel, having to take 3 tests, everything was very comfortable and very easy. So I felt very safe.
That's great. And so how are things now in Brazil? I know it's been a long road in Brazil.
Well,
how are you doing?
Brazil is a very special country. Brazilians don't like to follow the rules normally, and law enforcement is not our forte. So unfortunately, also with a big population of 211 million people, not easy to control. Also, we have remote places, and so we don't have to blame the authorities so much, but we had a tough year and a half. But right now we have 75% of the population has already taken 1 dose. 45% of the population has taken the 2 doses. And if you take the below 12 years old of this number, we have 60% of the adults with the 2 doses. And the forecast is that by the end of October, we will have 100% of above 12 years old with the 2 doses. And we are already giving a 3rd shot to the elderly. I think today is like 76 or 75 years old. This by age, day by day. If we talk about, you know, we are much better than we were. However, it's still very, very tough, because we still have an average of maybe 17,000 cases a day and about 600 deaths per day in average. So it's very bad. But we had like 80,000 average of cases per day in July. So it's getting much better, and we see the signs of the result of the vaccination. So things are getting back to normal in Brazil. There's a difference between states and cities, but overall, besides still having to wear the mask, although apparently this will end in a month or so, and people don't wear masks anyway outside, despite the rule. Although I can guarantee that chins are super protected in Brazil. Everybody wears a mask on the chin.
It just doesn't help.
Things are getting back to normal in day-to-day life.
That's
now.
great to hear. And apart from the masks, are you under any other restrictions? Can you travel? Obviously, you traveled to France.
Yeah. To come back to, if you go away, you have to follow the rules of the country and the airline. But to come back to Brazil, you have to have a PCR with a maximum 72 hours previous to the flight, and show your vaccination card. That's all. No quarantine except for countries like India, South Africa, North Ireland, and the UK. Anybody coming from these countries have to go to quarantine when they arrive.
Wow.
But nobody checks either. So.
That's the thing. That is the problem, isn't it? It's extraordinary, and that's really. I'm just very pleased to hear that you're approaching some level of freedom again. That's great, because it's been a very long, hard road. Thank you very much. Come back and talk in a minute a bit further. Sofia, how are you, and how do things look from where you're sitting in Monterrey in Mexico?
Well, very different, I think, Dom, to everybody else. I would say that we're kind of on the slower end of getting back to any kind of normal. But it's interesting because Mexico's always had kind of a very extreme viewpoint and the way they've done things. So there are no travel restrictions when you come into the country or out. So you don't have to show any proof of vaccination or of having a test before coming into the country. However, you know, everybody is still masked. I think we have around 55% of the population are now doubly vaccinated, but it seems from our perspective, it seems to be slowing down a little bit. You know, I haven't really heard anything about a third, you know, booster doses. I mean, they do kind of talk about it, but there are no sort of set plans. I think they want to finish with everybody else. But I think that the biggest thing for us as well are schools. You know, we are still not back to school properly, you know, this August, because the term here runs from August to June. Children started going 2 days a week, but only for a few hours. So that's very disruptive for families and for parents who work. So yeah, I mean, it's really different in some aspects. It's you know, very, very relaxed, and in other aspects, it's really not. So we've also just come out of a third wave that we had, but that's only just finished. Maybe I'd say it started going down maybe about 3 weeks ago. So I do feel like we're kind of on the end of everything else that's happening in other countries. So yeah, it's interesting.
And are you getting any signs from government about, you know, when things will, like, for example, restrictions will end, or are they just kind of playing it by day?
They just seem to be playing it by ear, really, Dom. I mean, it's yeah, you know, for us, and I think that's also, the mood is very much at the moment very kind of flat, in the sense that there's no, obviously we know there's no end as such, but there is no date on anything, you know, on schools going back, you know, 5 days a week, or on restrictions with masks or things like this. And as I was saying to you earlier as well, something that everyone's slightly uneasy about is the restrictions that are going to be lifted from the US. We have a large population in Mexico that have been vaccinated with Russian and Chinese vaccinations, and that is causing a lot of worry as well. So yeah, I think the fact that we don't really have you know, a date to look forward to, or to know when the more restrictions are going to be lifted, is I think it's mentally taxing and emotionally taxing, I would say.
It really is, and I think that's something that, you know, certainly we were saying before, the core governments are starting to look at this, and health services are starting to look at the kind of toll, the psychological toll that this is taking on people, because we're not built to live with this level of uncertainty. It's just Certainly not me. I've really struggled with that. Brenda, it's great to have you with us. Tell me, how do things look from where you're sitting in New York? Is the city open?
The city is absolutely open, and I'm happy to report it's really booming right now. We went from the spring market, March and April, where you were getting housing incentives, 3, 4, and 5 months rent free on a 1-year lease. And now, yeah. And so unfortunately, people still think that when they come into town that they might get a great deal like that. But in fact, we've gone to the complete other extreme where there's very scarce housing inventory, in particular that 3-bedroom and up size apartments for the families, where although the families took off during COVID, a lot of them have returned to the city. And we've always had a bit of a scarcity of that type of inventory, but right now we're seeing those apartments going for over asking, and really getting into bidding wars. It's very challenging. Yeah, so it's like night and day from springtime. A lot of the companies, they started coming back to the office probably in July. One of the big banks got the ball rolling, and then some of the other investment banks followed. And in September, I think a lot of companies came back to the office at least 3 days a week, and we're probably see the rest of them follow suit by January. But traffic is back. I think people aren't quite confident enough in the public transportation system that they're still driving in and out of the city. So traffic is crazy. We did gain some fabulous outdoor dining that we hope that we'll be able to hang on to. We're feeling a little bit European now. And so that was one perk that came out of COVID. People are wearing masks inside stores and public venues, but other than that, on the streets, it's a kind of a mixed bag. With the new variant out, folks are more cautious than they were a month ago, I would say. But schools are back in session live, and life is moving along. So
it's very interesting. So the masks wearing indoors, is that mandated, or is that just people doing it because of their own choice?
If it's, I think New York in particular has requested that people do it, but if it's a private business, they can dictate one way or the other whether they want to require patrons to wear masks. We just had a recent situation, because it's different here, obviously, from state to state. So out-of-staters came to New York. They didn't like that they were being asked to wear masks inside if they couldn't produce a vaccination card, and it turned into a big physical altercation at one of our beloved Manhattan restaurants. So it's definitely a sticking point right now that we don't have that unity in regarding the vaccinations from state to state.
That's fascinating. And Susan's just put into the chat box, and Broadway is back.
And so Broadway is back. That's very exciting. Yes.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's just so interesting how, this is playing out in so many different ways. I was just saying before the call, we were in London, and restrictions are off here, but people are still wearing masks. And you go into the galleries and most people are wearing masks, but then you get onto a boat going down the Thames and nobody is wearing a mask, and it's just odd. Maura, you are on the other side of the country in San Francisco. How are you, and how are things?
Thanks for asking. I'm great. Thanks very much. It's California was sort of a very early adopter of sort of masking. We have a very high vaccination rate. This is also the case in New York and other states back on the East Coast. So from that perspective, that feels good. There are both vaccination proof mandates required for indoor spaces here, very similar to New York, in restaurants and in gyms and in other sort of closely managed spaces in the Bay Area specifically. You're required to show sort of proof of vaccination and also to mask up, just because it's sort of safe and good practice. But sort of picking up the ball from what Brenda said, it's a big country. I'm sure you all are fully aware of the amount of media attention. Every single topic gets just sort of blown up out of proportion. So, you're constantly searching for that bright yellow path through the noise. Like, what is the actual story of what's going on? Obviously, the good news is sort of up and to the right relative to the vaccine rate. We're not as high, certainly, as I think we'd all like us to be. I checked just before I got on the call because it obviously changes constantly, but sort of at a 65%-ish rate, fully vaccinated adults, but much higher in lots of the cities, and a lot of the cities obviously where a lot of our inbound folks are coming from outside of the US. So I think you would find that it's scattered, but obviously trending in the right direction. And this whole concept of a employer mandated vaccination, which is again an idea promulgated by the president, hasn't yet become law, but everybody's sort of moving towards it, because people are looking for guidelines, right? You were asking, that we're not built to live with a level of uncertainty, certainly not at a national scale, right? We all can deal with it sort of in our own lives, but like you were saying, Laura, when you left the building, it's kind of like, this is what the world is like. People need some sense of, what should I expect? So I feel like that mandate, whether or not it's all sort of accepted individually, begins to give at least employers some guidelines, right? So then they know, who should come into the office, when's that going to be allowed, and so forth. And again, picking up on what Brenda said, in New York, the financial services companies kind of sort of came back to work sooner. Rest of country, it's still a very mixed bag relative to, work from home, work from office. But interestingly, I think that seems to be less of a sort of a marker for when the actual inbound international destination services activity has picked up. Somebody had mentioned, I think it was you, Sofia, relative, year over year, it's obviously been incredible. We're not quite back to 2019 as a year, but I would say as a month, the last couple of months in terms of just new orders have been, very stable relative to, the worst and darkest pandemic times, and more people committing to an actual move date. So it's one thing to be told, like, we're activating an order, and another thing to actually put a date in the calendar when you're expected, which, by the way, continues to move. But, a year ago, 6 months ago, we weren't even getting confirmation that, this person's moving. Also, they're going to be in Chicago or Milwaukee or New York or wherever, by a date certain, which is now very much the case. We have a very high percentage of sort of committed moves. And then the fun begins, again, sort of picking up what Brenda said. The availability of properties is a challenge, and not just in New York and the Bay Area, a little less so. There's still some vacancy here, but not so much in Seattle, not so much in Austin, certainly not in New York, not even in Houston. I mean, the markets have really, really, really picked up. And again, to Brenda's point, not only for large apartments, but it's the United States, right? Everybody wants to be a homeowner, right? So the number of people who want to actually rent single family homes for all kinds of reasons, right? Space, comfort, safety, a little bit outside the urban center. I mean, they are not to be had, as I'm sure you've all seen. Our real estate market has been very, very busy just, buying and selling homes. And so landlords who owned private properties that were rental properties have sort of joined the boom. And so many properties have been sold and taken out of rental inventory that when people come in and say, like, that's what I'd like to have, for me and my family, obviously we all do what we can to make that happen, but that there has been some scarcity there. Upside, with this sort of upswing in trend, we're fortunate enough, and I'm sure it's the case for our colleagues, to be, building our network and our consultants, and, the markets, sort of coming back. So it's fun, to be, adding back in and sort of getting ready for the wave. I think we all, our clients have been, nobody can predict the future, but they've been pretty buoyant, I would say, around what they see happening end of year and into the first part of 2022.
Well, that's fantastic to hear. I mean, it's so interesting over the last 18 months. We've all talked about different trends and different, how we're going to perceive how things are going to be in the future. And I think just tapping in on what both you and Brenda have said, certainly, we were all predicting this working from anywhere. Everyone's going to leave the expensive metropolitan urban areas and move somewhere far, far cheaper. That has not come to pass, has it? I mean, like you said, Brenda, to begin with, it kind of did, but now, no, reversing, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
very interesting, because here, I know I'm just reading something in the press yesterday. So because of the boom in staycations, because no one can travel, well, they can now, but before it was very difficult. So much property has been taken out of the long-term rental market and put into the Airbnb short-term market that the relocation are really struggling. Thank you so much, Maura. That's fascinating. And we'll come back. I'd like to talk to you more about some trends as you're seeing them, because again, from an international perspective. So Laura, coming back to you, how is mobility moving now in Brazil? Is it starting to move again?
It is, slowly but surely. We were lucky because we were working on some big projects with governmental or like the Air Force in Brazil, and these never stopped. So we continued working during the worst time of the pandemic on this side. And now we see the volume coming definitely back, not as pre-pandemic times, but in the relocation and the immigration division, we are slowly growing. Every month there's a little bit more, because the Ministry of Justice is granting visas, work visas. And although in some cities the federal police is still shut, we can work out the permits. It's possible to do it in different cities where they are open. And schools are back. I think with the opening of the frontiers, the families are starting to travel again. In Fink, we have been very lucky because we are very much diversified. So the moving division worked like crazy all the time, because in every crisis, we move people. Or everybody wants to leave Brazil, or everybody's coming back to Brazil, or there's always some movement. In the pandemic, we had a lot of domestic moves. Suddenly it was crazy. Like Maura and Brenda were saying, like everybody wanted to move to a bigger apartment or going to the country. Now they're all coming back. So it's been very, very busy and profitable, which is good. Fine arts, on the other hand, stopped completely for some time. Now it's back with some movement. You know, the good part is that in all the divisions, we were able to keep all jobs. We did not have to fire anybody, which was our main target. And we discovered many benefits from, you know, home office, and we're certainly not going back to exactly the same way we worked before.
That is very interesting, isn't it? I mean, we were just talking about that as a team, because we gave up the nice offices that we had, and we've all been working from home since last April. But there isn't the same creativity. We need to be able to get together, just even if it's only twice a week.
Absolutely.
Changing patterns, isn't it? Changing patterns.
That's why, in my opinion, a hybrid system is definitely the best.
Definitely. And Sofia, how are things? I mean, are you seeing any upswing, or has things remained stable, or are you waiting for things? What are your clients saying?
Yeah, well, I think we spoke about this a little bit in the last session. Mexico, because it never had those travel restrictions, we were always receiving, and you know, there was always clients that were kind of optimistic, and people who are willing to just travel, or maybe they were coming from somewhere else in Latin America and they thought, you know what, I feel safe enough to go to Mexico, or they were coming here to work from anywhere on the Mexican beaches. So we, you know, in terms of work, we've kind of seen a constant flow. So that's been fantastic for us. I think that from an immigration perspective, we have struggled a little bit, because consular appointments are the one thing that we're really struggling to get, and kind of, you know, that changing of, you know, where can you go, what restrictions are in different countries, where is the person based, that's changing all the time. So keeping up with that has been very difficult. But as we know, immigration offices in Mexico never closed. Wow. There were never any restrictions coming into the country. Yes, we've still struggled with housing. We're seeing the same thing as in the US, which is really interesting, and that's remained. And you know, going into 2022, I think that we will see the same amount of inbound that we've seen maybe over these last few months. moving again, as Laura was saying, that's another thing that never really stopped. People were either wanting to leave or wanting to come back in. So from that perspective, I think that, you know, I'm really happy that we've been able to keep everybody on the team. We've more or less managed to navigate all the different moving parts of all of this. And I think that for Mexico, it's had some benefits in the sense that it's a very bureaucratic country. So there's a lot of anything you do just takes such a long time, and you have to go to so many different government entities and get all this paperwork done. They have actually made some of those, you know, we've seen an improvement on some of the processes, not on others. Things like government websites are now, you know, more up to date, because before you would look on the website and it would say one thing and you'd go to the office and it would be something else. They're slightly more organized in that aspect as well. But still, in terms of timelines, you know, because they're obviously reducing the amount of people that they're seeing, and you have to physically go to a lot of these offices. As Laura was saying with the federal police, you know, the same kind of thing happens here. Whilst we don't have to register with the federal police, there are a lot of processes that do require physical presence of the person being there. And so that obviously means that I think the relocation, the cycle of settling in has actually become longer than it was before. So that's been quite a challenge as well.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Because again, all of these things sort of work at different paces. And I know, talking to colleagues all over the world, and I'm sure you have as well, you know, certain countries responded really quickly to going online with things like immigration processes and registration processes, and others just didn't. And, you know, that's made a huge difference. And I mean, if I can come to you, Brenda, because again, you know, being the massive diversity from state to state in the US, how's that been for you in terms of things? I know that for the longest time, you had no incoming immigration because the borders were pretty well sealed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been fortunate to see visas start to be processed, and people that have had their relocations on hold for a year and even a year and a half are finally being allowed to come into the country again. But it was a great point that Sofia brought up, just as far as how the government processes some have changed, and you mentioned some have become more automated, but we have one fundamental one, which is the Social Security Administration here, that has not. And they still, despite the fact that the US doesn't require a 2-week quarantine period, the Social Security does require you to be in the US for 14 days before you can even call to schedule an appointment for a Social Security application. And you know, that's causing a lot of delays. People can't get their Social Security, or they can't get paid in the US until they have their Social Security number. And the process to actually schedule that appointment is after that 2-week waiting period. You have to get on the phone on a Monday morning at 8 to 9 in the morning and just wait on hold to get through to schedule an appointment. And if you don't get in that week, those appointments are done, and you got to call back next Monday morning and try and get an appointment. So we've actually picked up a lot of business from other DSPs that maybe aren't New York City based, because their clients have been frustrated that they're not able to get their people's Social Security numbers. They can't get their people paid. So that's a big challenge.
That's a huge thing. I mean, and on a practical basis, what does that mean? I mean, what does the company do? Can you just pay into a credit card account and try and do things like that?
You know, each company has their own rules on it, whether they can continue to pay people on a balance sheet in the US, or whether they continue to pay them from their overseas payroll. But it's, you know, it's very challenging for them, and the employer becomes the bad guy. It's like, you brought me over here and now you can't pay me. Yeah. What? I have to fund everything for myself. Like that's not going over very well at all. So we're doing everything that we can. We actually have some very nice connections at the Social Security office that we're very thankful to, that help us to get our appointments quickly. It pays to be nice to people at the government offices.
No kidding, absolutely. Never ever irritated the bureaucrat. Yeah. And Maura, is that very much the same across your network? Because I mean, you're working.
Yeah, yes, exactly so. I mean, again, Brenda's just really nicely summarized it. I mean, the probably least efficient final mile step, you know, when you're trying to settle into the US, is getting that Social Security clearance for all the reasons Brenda just described, and what she just describes is a universal. So that process, even though it's manual is standard. And so that's the way it works everywhere. And in any of these locations where there's, sort of a surge of activity, there is a delay, obviously, in response. And, a lot of these folks, remember, were also working remotely. So the bureaucrats themselves doing these jobs, there's been churn in those roles. Again, I don't know what it looks like across the world, but in the US, we watch statistics like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where there are 10 million open jobs in the United States and 8 million applicants. So there is so much gap between fulfillment of jobs in every kind of job imaginable. A lot of it, obviously, sort of low level, entry level, pay and security concerns, which is why those jobs are unfilled. But there's millions of them. And so there is just a backlog created by the process, by the volume, and by the system itself. So yes, that's true. And exactly like Brenda said, that's of course the value we all add, right? Is the people, the systems, sort of how to get in and get what kind of access you have in a place like California. There's fortunately more than one Social Security office. Nice. So you need to just keep trying to mix and match everywhere you can. But then after that, of course, it's on to the License Bureau, which is another, kettle of fish, as they would say. It's just, it's the work we all have always done. It's just now, obviously it was all being done virtually before, trying to, sort of prepare people. And now that they've actually arrived, obviously the volume, is significant to plow through. I was going to comment on the fact, and I think a couple of the other ladies have already mentioned it, that again, a bright line coming out of this really, though, has been innovation. It's been really interesting to me to see that while obviously, some things like your Social Security process may never change, but not only some of the government steps, but I think all of us collectively in our businesses have had an opportunity to, sort of do, in our case, like new product development, new ideas. What are people thinking of? How can we launch stuff? And to your point, it does really help whenever possible to be in the office. So our headquarters office is open. It's not 100% fully staffed. We're hybriding, as I think some of the other folks have mentioned. But it's been interesting to me that, and to our business, that this hasn't all been everybody hiding in the basement for 2 years. There has been a lot of opportunity to think about things differently. I think sort of the hallmark of all of our businesses has been like, what can you deliver virtually? What can you deliver digitally? Obviously, at the end of the day, people show up, they want to be guided. They need to understand the new country and city they're moving to. But the number of tools I think that have been put into people's hands, I think is encouraging around sort of that, again, as I said before, sort of looking for those bright stories in all the noise. The idea that people are sort of picking up the opportunity to use all the information we all manage every day and put it at a better, more accessible use for our customers has been very heartening.
I think one of the things that's just been so fascinating to me, and actually fascinating is the wrong word, it's actually been so obvious to me, is how this industry has been so innovative in the whole time that I've been involved in it. People have moved and changed and done things differently and better and continually improving. And this last 2 years has just shown how incredible this industry is at giving the support that's so necessary, and never has support been more necessary for people that we serve as it has been over the last 2 years. So you're quite right, Maura. It's great to have seen. That's why I'm so frustrated I can't be in Chicago, just to have those conversations with everybody about how they've changed, what they're doing, because that's going to be the first, real example of being able to, have that sort of cultural exchange. So I'm going to sort of wrap up with the sort of final question, which I'll put to you, Laura, first. And this is a very unquantifiable, and I apologize for that, but how are people feeling in Brazil?
Oh, they're feeling great. Our president does not believe in COVID, so why should we worry? No, honestly, we have different people with different points of view. From the beginning, I think most of the young people were very reckless, and they really, they were gathering on parties on the street, even though it was not allowed. But as I said, nothing happened anyway. We have about 5%, I believe, according to the population that does not believe in the vaccine or does not trust the vaccine. So I don't know what's going to happen to those. But in general, I think that it was not a very, despite the tragedy that it really has been with so many losses, in general, the spirit is kind of up, you know. I think Brazilians are born in a crisis, live in a crisis, die in a crisis. There's always something extreme going on, and we are so used to that. And as Maura said, like every very bad thing, it also serves as an opportunity for us to evolve and to take good things out of it. And that's what we've done. I think a lot of companies and a lot of individuals have learned to adapt. But overall, our tropical way of living is still here.
I'm very glad to hear it. That's good. I think, again, it's very interesting. Like I say, we've all been talking to our colleagues all over the world. There's been such a cultural influence on how different cultures have adapted, responded. I mean, like you were saying, Laura, I know my colleagues in Spain were saying at the beginning of this, there was no way the young people were not going to be out in the bars until 3 o'clock in the morning. There was just no way that was going to happen. Whereas in the UK, everyone was glad to get home at 8 o'clock. You know? But Sofia, how about Mexico? What's the kind of general feeling?
I think probably quite similar to Laura, the fact that, you know, we're a Latin country. People are very resilient. They're just used to so many things happening all the time. There's a huge lack of confidence in the government, and the pandemic hasn't changed that. And if anything, I think it's accentuated some of those points. I do feel that people are feeling more optimistic, and, you know, hoping that this is kind of a step towards getting back to a normal life. There's a lot of frustration with the way certain things are being handled, especially in terms of schooling. And I think that as well, the people there's a feeling of, there's a lot more confidence in kind of the private sector and the way that each sort of the companies and institutions are handling the pandemic. And I think that that is actually what creates confidence, and rather than the governments. You know, you would kind of expect the government to lead that, but they don't. I think it varies a lot state to state as well. As with Brazil, we have a lot of remote areas, but I think that overall people are feeling like this may be kind of the beginning of getting back to some kind of normal. So hopefully that's, you know, where we're headed here in Mexico.
I'm very pleased to hear it. And I mean, it is very peculiar when you look back at this journey that we've all been through. I mean, I remember, you know, having conversations in the office back last March, you know, fully expecting the Seville conference to go ahead 3 months later. You know, we all thought this would be over in 6 weeks. And here we are 18 months later. Maura, I'm going to come to you if I can, because again, you know, you were saying about, you know, picking up on what Sofia was saying, in terms of things like the US, the diversity of the US in terms of accepting how things are kind of going to move forward. If you were to look into a crystal ball, what do you think is the single big thing? Is it going to be politics that's going to drive this forward? Is it going to be the commercial sector, the business sector that's going to drive this forward now?
Wow. Well, I'm pretty underqualified to speak to both, but since you've given me a platform, I think what you said was really insightful. And I mean, you know, the US is 330 million people, 50 states, you know, literally tens of thousands of municipalities. And I would say, for all the noise and the media attention, I think what you said is really actually true. I mean, it's not that the politics isn't important. People obviously need to, you know, take good care of each other and not do crazy things. And yet I think ultimately it's kind of like, really what we're asking the government to do is get the science under control, right? You know, make the vaccine possible, get it distributed, give us a general framework to work with, and we'll take it from there, right? And I think that, so when you were talking about sort of, you know, not only personal, but just sort of local level, I think that's sort of, you know, it's always been, you know, sort of the tug and pull of the US. So I think we're looking for sort of background direction, but ultimately sort of like local. And I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's a very commercial country. If you've ever been here, you know that, right? I mean, commerce means everything in the US. I mean, that's really our culture. And so I do think there's been, as I said before, not only innovation, but also just sort of like people do just want to get on, you know, they want to get on with their lives. It's been obviously with 330 million people, you know, some people have been extremely, you know, adversely hurt, and other folks, you know, like I said, it's been an opportunity for businesses to thrive and, you know, new ideas to come out. So I would say sort of the general sort of gut level is like, if I can live through this, I can manage my way forward. And, that's sort of, I know they're cliches, but I think accurate, sort of independent spirit, sense of personal ownership. Like, I've got this, make it, clear the rocks out of the road, and then we'll take it from there. That's the way I would think. That's the general feel. And it's speaking for a lot. So I don't know, Brenda, how you feel as another American among 330 million of us, but I'd be interested in your assessment.
Yeah, me too.
Well, thanks, Maura. I'm really glad that you took that question because that was a lot packed into one, and you did a beautiful job answering it. I do think in New York in particular, and with the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, we all feel like we've been through this, and like Laura and Sofia were saying, in their countries, New Yorkers are very resilient. And after the initial shock of COVID sort of wore off, we got innovative and we dug our heels in and said, we're not going to let this keep us down. And I think now it was really refreshing to see folks coming in from other countries as they were able to start coming in, that were just feeling like we had a lot more freedoms here at that time to be out and sitting at restaurants outside if they were coming in from Europe and they didn't have that freedom there. So that was a lot of positive energy that they brought in. And also at the beginning of COVID, where the real estate market was tanking, some young people started coming into the city again and taking advantage of those real estate deals. And even if they were living in a roommate situation, they finally could manage to afford to get into the city. So that brought a lot of wonderful young energy in. And I think all of that is helping us to get back on our feet. And if you go down to the West Village on a Saturday night now, people are out. People are dressed up and they are ready to be out. And you feel like, wow, it doesn't even seem like there's a pandemic at the moment as far as that goes. So that's really refreshing. And we're very positive about onward and upward. Let's get on with this thing.
I think it's really interesting that actually we've got represented here three of the cultures who are the least risk averse on the scale of Hofstede, which is really interesting, whereas I mean, what was so fascinating to me when you look at this culturally, so Sweden is one of the most least, one of the most risk averse countries in the world, and yet they had the most open policy about how to deal with COVID. So it's just so odd. Like you say, I think in the end it just comes down to individuals. I cannot thank you enough. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Please put them in the chat box and put them in the Q&A. Thank you, Patricia. Concha, thank you very much indeed. Concha's running an international mobility meeting in Madrid, would like people from other countries with international experience of moving to participate online. So there are the details. I will be sending out the recording link to this on Monday before I leave for my first face-to-face real board meeting in 2 whole weeks.
Exciting.
Believe it. I really can't thank you enough. Laura, Sofia, Brenda, Maura, it's been a fascinating conversation. I think we'll keep these conversations going until we can actually all see each other. I'm so sorry I won't see you in Chicago, but have a wonderful time at WERC.
We'll send you a card.
And we'll see you in Seville with everything crossed and knock on wood. We're planning.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everybody who joined in today, and take care, and we'll speak soon.